Taking a look at the upcoming NFL draft, but through the eyes of a GM. That plus more on Thursday's edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast for March 27th, 2025.
You are Locked On Raiders, your daily Las Vegas Raiders podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome in, Raider Nation, to another edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen of the day. We definitely appreciate you if you're catching the show wherever you find your favorite podcast, or you're checking us out on the YouTube page. You know we appreciate both. The show grows each and every day. That's because of your support and obviously the job that my man Ari does behind the scenes, making sure we look good and sound good each and every day. You can shout him out. You can appreciate him. He's on Twitter at Ari Produces. You can hit me up as well at your boy Q254. And if you ever want to be a part of the show, as many of you do, 707-654-4693. That's the Locked On Raider podcast voicemail line. A lot of calls, a lot of texts. We'll try to get to as many as possible coming up in segment number 3 as we close out the show and we get a little bit closer to closing out the week. These weeks are flying by, so we're going to have a lot of fun. But, man, before you know it, we'll be in Green Bay talking about, well, getting ready for round 1 of the draft, right? I mean, and then we'll be talking about who the Raiders actually drafted as opposed to what we think might happen in round 2, round 3, round 4, obviously round 1, right? I mean, it's just the whole shebang will be here before you know it. But a lot of feedback, obviously, leading up to it. We'll get as much in as possible coming up, segment number 3. Segment number 2, want to take a look at the NFL draft and not necessarily the players. What I want to take a look at is how to approach the draft, from a GM. I mentioned it on Wednesday's show. Former GM Mike Tannenbaum, Mike T from ESPN. He was in the Jets organization as the GM. He was in the Miami Dolphins organization. He had a big conference call on Wednesday by ESPN and, really broke it down, talked all things draft. And, he has his mock draft out as well. But he's not one of the mock draft, guru guys, the draft analysts, the guys that do it all year long. He's taking it from a GM's type of point of view. So I think that's a really good approach and something really good to listen to as well. So in segment number 2, got a bunch of sound bites when it comes to just taking a look to what the approach should be, could be, why it is to the NFL draft. And up to on tomorrow, we'll actually, get a few sound bites from Mike T on a few players in particular. But more importantly, it's going to be about the process in segment number 2 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Here in segment number 1, news and notes. There's not a lot of news and notes to get to, but a really good call from a member of Raider Nation, and it really leads to some good conversation. I'll explain what that means after I tell you about the title sponsor of the show, which is Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. So as pro days are going on, Boise State held their pro day. Obviously, that means Ashton Jeanty, Raiders GM John Spytek, was there present watching Ashton Jeanty perform. And he put on a heck of a show. I was actually supposed to have a guy that covers Boise State and was at the pro day. He was supposed to be on my radio show on Wednesday, but he had to push back because the pro day went so long. So he's actually going to be on my show a little bit later on today. So I'm looking forward to that. But Ashton Jeanty, from all understanding, put on a heck of a show. Louis Riddick from ESPN, I think we all have a lot of respect for him. He was there in attendance, and he tweeted out, but I was tripping when I said he's Emmitt Smith with home run speed. Yeah, okay. Again, he's been a big fan of Ashton Jeanty. A lot of people are. All 32 teams were represented at Boise State's pro day, and that's because of that guy named Ashton Jeanty. So again, we'll do a little bit deep diving into their pro day. We'll do that, tomorrow as I get some sound from that today. And then also we'll take a look at UT tomorrow as well. Supposed to look at UT today, but because we have that sound from Mike T coming up in segment number 2, I'll just push the UT, the Texas Longhorns conversation back to tomorrow as well. We got plenty of time to get this thing rolling, right? But I did want you to hear this call from one of your own. I mentioned it on Wednesday. Raider Rickey in Virginia, he called in. It's been a minute since he's called in, but as we're talking about what to do at number 6, we've been going back and forth when it comes to the Locked On NFL mock draft, what I should do when I make my selection. I got to turn the card in. Right, I got to get that thing cooking before the weekend. I've got to already have my decision. I got to drop a video and just make it do what it do. So we've been talking about Ashton Jeanty. We've been talking about Armand Membu, the offensive tackle out of Missouri. Been talking about Teteroa McMillan, the wide receiver out of Arizona, and others, right? And others that could possibly be in that position. Mason Graham, defensive tackle out of Michigan. Not that I think he's going to be there available at 6, but Raider Rickey really brought something to my attention, and I thought this call was so good that I took it to my radio show on Wednesday and made a whole show, like a 3-hour show. I basically turn this call into, right? Because I thought it was so good that we could throw it out there and get a lot of feedback immediately. So here's Raider Rickey in Virginia talking about his expectations, what he's looking for the Raiders to do at pick number 6. Check it out.
Hey, Q, it's Raider Rickey from Virginia. Calling in, been a while, but I was going to talk about the pick at number 6. I was sitting there thinking, I believe one of your callers the other day said, if you drafting at 6, you're going to get a blue chip player, and that's what we want. And Genty just doesn't really, I would be happy with it, but it just seems like it just wouldn't be, I don't know, what I would want, number 1, I guess. I'm just thinking if I'm going to draft someone at 6 and thinking a blue chip player, I'm thinking someone that we could sign to 2 or 3 contracts and keep them around like Max. But I don't think we would be able to do that with Genty. Now I know it's more of a win now kind of pick, but I would think more Graham's if it's a tackle, the offensive tackle out of Missouri. I was just thinking blue chip player at 6. I'm thinking a person we could sign for 2 or 3 contracts at that pick. But I don't know. Just calling in, giving my 2 cents. But love listening to your show, man. Can't wait to hear your show tomorrow. We'll holler at you.
So I thought that was a really good call. Blue chip player, right? And then a guy who could sign multiple contracts. So on my radio show on Wednesday, I was saying, how important is that to you, right? A guy that you expect to be able to sign multiple contracts, because if that's a prerequisite, if that's something that you're looking for, then Ashton Genty might not be the guy for you at number 6. We know how the running backs are treated, right? And so not that often do you see a running back get that second deal with his team, especially now, right? I mean, you see, Josh Jacobs got another contract, but he got the franchise tag, and then boom, his next actual contract was with another team. I know Derrick Henry had 8 years with Tennessee. I get that, but now in day and age, it feels like they're going to run him into the ground for 4 or 5 years and then let somebody else pay him, right? So that might not be a wise decision. So if multiple contracts mean something to you, like Raider Rickey in Virginia mentioned, then maybe Armand Membu, the offensive tackle, makes more sense. To double down on that, I had Trey Wingo, former ESPN employee. He's been covering the NFL draft, covering the NFL for a very long time. He was also part of 33rdteam.com, amongst other things. I mean, dude does all kind of different jobs, but always is covering the NFL. He was a guest on my show, and I asked him straight up about that pick and also a follow-up when it comes to Genty and Membu. But hear what Trey Wingo had to say about that pick number 6, what the goal should be for the Raiders. If you're the Raiders sitting there at number 6, and you're Pete Carroll and John Spytek, what do you believe the ultimate goal should be when they come out of this draft at the end of April, especially with that first pick they have?
Look, at the end of the day, you want to get the most value out of the pick. And that's the thing that a lot of people don't understand. Always good to be with you, man. They think, well, what's the player we got to have? You can't look at as a draft pick as a player. You have to look at the draft pick as a commodity. And what value does that commodity have? Does it have more value to you as a franchise for a specific player that you think you can get at 6 and won't be able to get somewhere else? Or does that pick have a value to your franchise that can be added by dealing that pick because somebody else thinks somebody else in the draft is more important than you think they are? So the best way to play, especially in a situation where we have a draft where, there's not a lot of people saying these guys are by far the top players in the draft. They're heads and shoulders above everybody else. The best way to play this is be as open as possible about the value of that commodity. And that's, if you have a player that you are 100% locked in on, go for it. But if you don't, treat that pick as what it is, which is something that can be used as a value to your franchise to bring it something better than just a certain player. And I think that's the way they have to operate.
So when I'm looking at it, and we've been having a lot of good discussions here on Raider Nation Radio 920, we've been talking about Armand Membu, the offensive tackle out of Missouri, and we've been talking about Ashton Genty, the running back out of Boise State. Is the better value the offensive tackle or the playmaker?
I think it might be the offensive tackle. Everybody, this is the time of year, right, where we start having mock drafts and all this kind of stuff. And let's just be honest about it. We're very rarely right about any of this.
Right.
You just go back to 2021. Oh, my God, anybody would have taken Trevor Lawrence with the number 1 overall pick that year. And it hasn't really worked out that well. So, he got paid, and they're sort of stuck with him. But I think it's fair to say that he's he's under-delivered. So you go through this process every year, and it really is, as much as we put so much time and effort into it, it really is at best educated guesswork. Mm-hmm. I mean, it really is, because we're talking about, what happens to these kids when they get away from, the things that they're familiar with. And, they got to choose for the most part where they went to college, and now they're being chosen. How do you deal with that? Sometimes these are kids that are, pre-NIL, but, getting money for the first time, gobs of money. How does that change them? There's so many factors that go into this beyond what you see on the field, and that's the hard part to digest and evaluate as you go into the draft.
Value. And you hear the follow-up. So in that case, where's the value? Ashton Genty, Armand Membu, and he said, well, very easily could be the offensive tackle. Not trying to persuade you to go one way or the other with your decision, or not trying to, lean heavily into, well, that's going to make my decision. That's the sealer. That's the deal sealer right there. Like, I'm not saying that either, but I like to hear both sides of the conversation. I like to be able to get plenty of feedback and like knowledge, right? Like to be educational around here and just hear what others have to say. And I think that there's a lot of good arguments for any of these guys that we've been talking about consistently for the Raiders at pick number 6. So I thought that was some pretty intriguing stuff. But that's what I got for you for segment number 1 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Kind of news and notes, not really, just kind of going with the theme of what we've been talking about the last few days here on the Locked On Raiders podcast. Coming up in segment number 2, though, we'll turn our attention to the draft. How do you attack it from a GM's point of view? Good stuff from Mike T coming up next here on today's edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast. Before we get to that, though, I do want to tell you about the title sponsor of the show, and that's Gametime. Imagine watching your favorite team live. And there's plenty of games to be watched today, right? Feeling the energy of the crowd, witnessing unforgettable moments. There's nothing like experiencing a big game in person. Getting tickets shouldn't be stressful. That's where Gametime comes in, making it easier than ever to grab last-minute seats at unbeatable prices. And it's not just sports. It's concerts, comedy, theater. Just finding your tickets, easiest way possible, they absolutely do. Gametime Picks makes it so easy to find better value for all the tickets that you want. You can check the Gametime app, find all the amazing deals and all the huge matchups that are coming up. Plus the lowest price guarantee, Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference if you find something better. And then the seat views before you buy. I love that. That's one of my favorites. You know exactly what it looks like when you get to your seats. Like, hey, there's no surprises. Surprise. No, none of that. No surprise fees either. A lowest price guarantee. You can book with total confidence. So what do you need to do? Right now, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create the account, use promo code LOCKEDONNFL. It's all one word for $20 off your first purchase. That's LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. All right, Raider Nation, here we go. Segment number 2 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Want to attack the NFL draft, but I want to do it from a GM, a former GM's point of view. So we always talk about what, the Mel Kipers, the Daniel Jeremiahs, the Jordan Reeds, the Matt Millers. We talk about what those guys are thinking when it comes to the draft and how they mock these players. I don't want to really focus in on the players. I want to focus in on the process. I think that that's a part of it as well. And I think the more knowledge we have, the better we can do, and we can make a better educated guess, because at the end of the day, it's all an educated guess, as you heard Trey Wingo say earlier in segment number 1. So Mike Tannenbaum, Mike T, he had a big conference call, just like Mel Kiper does his conference call, just like Daniel Jeremiah does his. It wasn't as long as those guys' conference call, but it was still some meaningful stuff as far as I was concerned. So this is all about the process. We'll talk about some of the players tomorrow, but all about the process when it comes to Mike T. So off top, he was asked, what would be considered a successful draft? When you're a GM and you feel like, hey, I did a really good job in that draft, how do you know what would be considered successful?
I would say, generally speaking, 3 to 4 meaningful contributors. We've been talking a lot about Shedeur Sanders. My comp for him is Kirk Cousins. I was on Get Up yesterday, and Tim Hasselbeck's was Andy Dalton. And those are 2 really good players that played a long time at the quarterback position. And I think if you get Shedeur at 3, 10, 23, 33, 43, he should be a good player. And that's a good draft choice. Now, people are going to quibble with, well, hey, if you take Shedeur Sanders at 3, should he be an elite difference maker? And, I just see that a little bit different. I think if you add 3 or 4 meaningfully contributing players and you do that over 3, 4, 5 years, you have a cost controlled roster that has sustained success. So I know we get so caught up on, when you pick and what they should be, but I think that's a general rule of thumb, Dave.
3 to 4 meaningful contributors, Mike Tannenbaum. He brought up Shedeur, not me. LOL. The point of the sound was for, what you're looking for in the draft. So don't get mad at me. I'm just a weatherman. I'm just telling you that it's going to be sunny today. If you choose to wear a jacket, that's on you. No, but in reality, it's just funny. He's talking about 3 to 4 meaningful contributors. So when you look at the Raiders last year, Brock Bowers, no brainer, right? Jackson Powers Johnson, meaningful contributor? Absolutely. Right? DJ Glaze, meaningful contributor? Absolutely. That's 3 right there. And you could say that, DeCam Richardson was a meaningful contributor, right? As a 4th round pick. Now, I know that he had ups and downs, but he played a lot of snaps. So if we're taking that philosophy, 3 to 4 meaningful contributors, I think Tom Telesco in his only year as a GM with the Raiders had a successful draft. So now that's going to be John Spytek's job. 3 to 4 meaningful contributors. Obviously, you want your first pick to be, a blue chip player, be a big time player, be a guy that you can expect to be a Pro Bowler. But I like the breakdown. 3 to 4 meaningful contributors. The Raiders currently have 9 overall picks. So if you can get 3 to 4 meaningful contributors each and every year, you're on to something. But you've got to be able to have the same guys in place that are looking for the same thing in the same type of players, right? So that's obviously a big part of it as well. Another big question that's always asked is about the quarterback room, right? We've had discussions here. Well, if you got Geno Smith, do you need another quarterback? Should you go get one if you already have one, right? So here's Mike Tannenbaum on how you should build a quarterback room, again, from a GM standpoint.
Yeah, and I think it's something that I think at different points in my career, we did a better job of that than others. Like I would look back at my time in Miami and say, like, we could have done a better job of having, once Ryan Tannehill got hurt, we were pretty bare. I think it's so important that you win for today and develop for tomorrow. And, just bringing your question forward, I had Jackson Dart going to the Rams, for example. Look, they got Jimmy Garoppolo. When they drafted Stetson Bennett, that was obviously an eye towards the future. And I do think you win for today and develop for tomorrow and you keep trying. And, the best example of that is, the legendary Ron Wolf, Elliot Wolf's father. You go back and do an autopsy of what they did in Green Bay from Mark Brunell, Aaron Brooks, Matt Hasselbeck. Every year they were adding guys behind, Favre, and then ultimately, Aaron Rodgers obviously replaced Favre. But I think that's so important to try to have, cost certainty at the position. And you look now at what Green Bay did. They traded a 4th round pick to get Jordan Love. And that trade looks like an absolute no-brainer. And I think that mindset is something you need to do at that position.
Win for today, prepare for tomorrow. Win for today, prepare for tomorrow. Continue to draft a guy and add them to the room, right? They're always going to be needed. We know that's a fact. You can flip them like we've seen, the Patriots in prior years do, other teams in prior years. Green Bay, he mentioned Green Bay. Perfect example, right? A team that consistently built through the draft when it came to drafting quarterbacks. Obviously, they finally landed on Aaron Rodgers, and they're like, yeah, we're good. And then you saw what they did when they made the move to get Jordan Love. Yeah, they're good, right? They're the team that's never stressing having a quarterback because they always have one. So just because the Raiders have Geno Smith doesn't mean that they're not going to add to the quarterback room. And I'm not saying that's in the first round, but I'm saying that sometime this draft, I definitely expect them to come away with a quarterback. And if he's the right guy, great. If he's not, guess what? Do it again. You don't want to be these teams that are desperate, out there waiting like like the kid that's trying to get the date to the prom, waiting for the phone to ring, be like, yeah, okay, I'll go. All right. No, you don't want to be that. You don't want to be that team. And there's teams out there right now that are doing that. And the Raiders aren't one of them, which is great, right? They solved that issue immediately. That was a good thing. So that's how to build a quarterback room, according to Mike Tannenbaum, the former GM of the Jets, obviously was in the front office of the Miami Dolphins as well. Comp picks is something that we've talked about a lot, especially with free agency going on and the fact that when you lose a bunch of guys like the Raiders have when they lost Trayvon Merrick, right? They lost Nate Hobbs. They've lost others, right? So they're potentially picking up compensatory picks. So if you're picking up compensatory picks, that's a good thing. The good franchises do it. So Mike T was asked about collecting compensatory picks. And then also, if teams that need quarterbacks now should say, well, this isn't the draft class for a quarterback, so let's focus on 2026. Here's Mike T on that.
Yeah, so Ray, a couple of thoughts on that. Bart Scott, one of my ESPN teammates, has for the last 6 or 7 months, espoused the theory that the Giants are trying to tank this year so they could get Arch Manning next year. And I'm just like, Bart, there's just like way too many variables that happen that, like what happens if Arch Manning stays another year? What happens if you win 2 games at the end unexpectedly, like we saw this year? So I love the comp pick approach. I think no one's done that better, more consistently than Baltimore year in, year out. And again, goes back to what we talked about earlier. It's just another mechanism to, sort of acquire cost certain players for 4 years. And again, for Pittsburgh, I just don't think you can lock in and say, hey, next year's class is going to be better. Because at the end of the day, we just don't know. If we were sitting here today, a year ago today, and we were talking about a Washington State transfer who started his career at Incarnate Word, nobody would say like, oh, he may be, the first pick in the draft. So I think there's just too many variables to sort of like, hey, target, like we're going to approach it, for this year, for this position. I just think it's way too hard and just too many variables.
Mike T right there talking about the comp picks. You hear what he had to say about Baltimore. They're one of those teams, and I believe they have 4 this year, 4 comp picks. I think the Raiders need to be that team that starts to learn to do that. San Francisco does it really well. The Raiders need to do that. And they're going to get some compensatory picks in 2026 for sure. They have 2 this year. I would love to see them consistently up there around 3 or 4, meaning that they draft really well, develop really well. Their free agents go off to other teams, sign big deals. They're not, just overspending in free agency. They're not doing like the Patriots that are signing everybody, right? And so they're getting compensatory picks back because those things matter, not to mention they can be traded now. At one point they couldn't. Now they could be traded. And also when it comes to, the quarterbacks and saying, well, this draft class isn't so hot for the quarterbacks. So let's just focus in on 2026. Like Bart Scott, and I heard him mention it. Bart Scott thinks that the Giants are already basically tanking for 2026, but there's too many things that could happen. And I love the fact that he said, Arch Manning might not even come out, right? And I've heard Raider Nation say, oh, just go draft Arch next year. What if he doesn't come out, right? You can't bank on that. You don't know what a college kid's going to do, especially with NIL. You nothing, and then you never know. Like Carson Beck was supposed to be the hot guy. Remember in Georgia, he was going to be the dude, and then he had a bad year, and he decided to stay at school. Like, I mean, there's so many things that can happen. You can't just say, oh yeah, let's just punt on the quarterback and go get him in 2026. That's why if you have an opportunity to go get him, you've got to go get him. We've talked about the quarterback. Just say if Shedeur, only because there's only 2 quarterbacks in the top of the draft that we all expect to go. If he were to be there at 6, I think the Raiders would have to seriously consider taking him for those reasons. Not to bring him up, but because that's just the name of the game, and we know that there's only 2 that we expect to go in the top 10, unless you believe Jackson Dart is a top 10 guy, which, more people sound like they're believing that. So that's a possibility. So any of those quarterbacks, if they have the chance to take any of those 3, Cam Ward's going to Tennessee, so it won't be him. But if they have a chance to take a guy, they at least have to think about it. They don't necessarily have to do it, but they actually have to think about it. Just got a couple more sound bites from Mike T from his conference call that he had on Wednesday. And this one's about a bad draft or 2. Raider Nation knows about a bad draft or 2, right? How far that can set your team back. And even worse, how can it hurt if you miss on a first-round quarterback? This is really something that had to do with the Tennessee Titans, but I think that we all could understand and relate to what he has to say here.
Yeah, well, you could see it when you miss on a first-round quarterback, and you could literally just go back and look at Sam Darnold at the Jets, Baker Mayfield, Zach Wilson at the Jets. Just when you miss on a first-round pick, Daniel Jones, it just sets you back. So, look, that's the bad news. The good news is you can flip it pretty quick. And certainly, like you look at teams like the Rams and the Eagles, where they had invested a first-round pick in Goff and Wentz, paid them over $100 million guaranteed, and obviously moved on to Stafford and Hurts. So, the bad news, it can set you back. But the good news is you can flip it pretty fast. The key is to have somebody at the quarterback position. And look, I'm not saying Will Levis's career is over, but barring something unforeseen, I think Cam Ward will be a massive upgrade and a much better fit for Brian Callahan's offense than Will Levis.
So there you hear Mike T. He identifies some misses in round 1, right? I actually think Baker Mayfield did some good things in Cleveland. He got him to the playoffs, but they wanted more. They got greedy, and they went for Deshaun Watson, an upgrade, and that clearly was not an upgrade. And well, you see where they're at right now. But the other ones were definitely misses. And we all know about missing players in the first round and even in the draft in general, not hitting on your picks, not getting those 3 to 4 meaningful contributors each and every year. all of a sudden your talent is just not there. The talent pool is not there, right? You have no depth. So you may have, your starters are really talented dudes, but if you suffer a couple of injuries, then what? Then all of a sudden you're stuck. Then you're in a bad position. Then you're like, well, what do you do now? Now you got guys that you never heard of out there playing, and that's not what you want. So the really good teams that are getting the 3 to 4 meaningful contributors each and every year, they're stacking the talent. So you have to be able to stack the talent. One of the big keys, one of the big responsibilities for a GM, as Mike T used to be a GM for the New York Jets. One more, and I think this one is kind of a shorter one, though. It's on trading back. And a lot of times you hear fans, we've had a lot of calls and texts about trade back. Mike T talking about the process of trading back.
Yeah, and I've learned both positively and negatively. Like when you trade back and you go back 10 spots, you better have 10 players that you feel really, really good about. If you trade back saying like, we're going to get player X, that's happened to me where that didn't work out. And fortunately, the player that was picked didn't turn out to be the player that the team that drafted him or us thought he was going to be, fortunately. But I think you have to be really careful on the trade back scenario and really feel comfortable with all the different scenarios that could play out.
See, that's an important nugget. I know it's only about 30 seconds, but that to me was an important nugget. Everyone always talks about trading back, but you have to realize what's at risk, right? If you trade back, you better know what you want and who you want. And like he said, if you're going to trade back 10 spots, you better have 10 guys you're comfortable with drafting, right? And I'm not even talking about trading back 10 spots, but if the Raiders are at 6 and they're talking about trading back, say, to 12, they better have 6 dudes that they're like, yep, okay, we feel comfortable taking any of these 6 guys, and we'll walk away feeling good about ourselves. If you do, then yeah, trading back's a good idea. If you don't, you better not do it. If there's only 1 guy or 2 guys in mind, you can't run that risk, even if you do pick up extra draft capital, because like he said, he's been on the wrong side of that. He's been on the wrong side and the right side, but being on the wrong side of it stinks. You don't want to be that. If you are going to trade back 1 spot, okay, cool, you got your guy. If you're going to trade back 3, 4, 5 spots, you better have 3, 4, 5 guys that you're comfortable with drafting. If you're not, don't do it. So, we don't have a look at the Raiders' big board, so I can't tell you how many spots they would be comfortable trading back. But if they are thinking about it, and they have to be, it has to be part of the scenario. Trading up's got to be part of the scenario as well. They have to be comfortable with going back. This is like setting a bar. This is how far we're comfortable going back, because this is how many players we feel are draftable in this range. As long as they set that, they feel very good about it, comfortable, and that they're going to get a meaningful contributor out of it, then by all means do it. But if you don't have that in place, don't do it. Stick and pick. That's the way to go. So that's just the way to look at the draft from a former GM's point of view. Again, I thought that it was a really good angle to take a look at and hear from, just so we could think about the process as opposed to just who's going to get picked here and why. And what this player does really well, that is the reason why this team goes and gets them. So I thought that was some really good, meaningful stuff, and hopefully you did as well. We'll hear from you next, as a matter of fact. 707-654-4693. Your calls and texts will close out the show on today's edition of the Locked On Raiders podcast. Here we go, Raider Nation. Segment number 3 of today's Locked On Raiders podcast. Your calls and texts draft that Locked On Raider podcast voicemail line, 707-654-4693. We heard from Raider Rickey in Virginia in the first segment, but now it's your time to shine. It's all you. I'm going to get out the way. Up first, we got a text from Ant Dog. Yo, Q, Ant Dog Raider from the ATL. I want to chime in on your draft. If by some chance Sanders is there, you take him. If not, I think you take Tet. The wide receiver class drops off noticeably after Teterola, McMillan. Bowers, Myers, and Tet would be hard to defend. Love the show, my guy. Listen while I'm drinking my morning cup of coffee. Raiders. That's Ant Dog Raider in the ATL. Thanks for the text. And wide receiver is, getting a little bit more conversation. And it's funny, it's not just McMillan anymore. Matthew Golden out of Texas is getting some love as well. And if we go by what Raider Rickey in Virginia said, McMillan is the guy, or Matthew Golden as the wide receiver that you could see, okay, hey, you draft that guy at number 6, or even if you trade back, say, to 9 and get him, then, hey, I could see that guy getting multiple contracts because he's a wide receiver where the wear and tear on his body is not as severe as it is on a running back. So, again, going back, thinking what Raider Rickey had to say, kind of adding that equation to the mix, I think it all plays a role. But, Ant Dog, thanks so much for the text. Definitely appreciate you. Got a call from Eddie S. in the 323. He's calling to talk about the Locked On NFL mock draft and what the Raiders should do at pick number 6.
Hey, Q, this is Elias from the 323. Want to give my feedback on your mock draft here for the Locked On network. So my heart is telling me we need to go with Genty because he's an explosive player. But I think the smart decision here for the long haul of the Raiders would be to go with Membu, because if we don't have a solid offensive line in front of Genty, yes, in college he was a very explosive player, but the NFL is the NFL for a reason, right? It is only the best of the best. So if we don't have a solid offensive line in front of him, who knows what he's actually going to do. Now, so yeah, that's pretty much what I think, right? Heart's telling me Genty, and he would be a great player, right? I would love to see him in the silver and black, but my head tells me we got to go with Membu because he is the smarter pick here. So yeah, that's my thoughts on it. Love your show. Love what you do, Q. Go Raiders.
Thanks so much for the call, Eddie S. Appreciate you. And you know, the funny thing is your thoughts are mine, right? I'm coming around on Genty at 6 because what he can do for the team as far as making plays, right? He's a home run hitter. It would be great to see someone putting the ball in the end zone like John McClain said. You know, Al Davis would say, get the guy that can put the ball in the end zone consistently. He can definitely do that. We know how big he could be, what kind of player he could be, especially if his floor truly is Josh Jacobs, as Bucky Brooks mentioned the other day. But then my brain is saying the smarter move is Membu, right? He could be on the offensive line, for years, right? So it's wild. Plus, like a week ago or so, I was talking about a little bit of concern about the offensive line. Well, you know how you fix a concern on the offensive line? Address it, right? Put somebody on the offensive line. I had someone call in my radio show on Wednesday, and they said, well, Q, what if I feel like the offensive line was good and I don't need to address the offensive line? Well, then if the offensive line was good, and if the Raiders truly do believe that, and that's what Pete Carroll told us in Indianapolis at the Combine, then by all means go with the playmaker. If you feel like that O-line is set in stone and it's good to go, then yeah, then you don't need to address it. You can get guys for depth later on, but if you don't really truly believe that, and I'm not 100% sold on that, right? It might make more sense for Membu. Again, the guy who's going to sell jerseys, the guy who's going to put butts in the seats, the guy that's going to make some excitement after day one of the draft will be Genty. The guy who might make the long-term excitement could be Membu. Just like Colton Miller. I wasn't a big fan when Colton Miller got selected. What was it, number 17 overall? Whatever the case may be, right? I forget the Raiders traded back a few times and got him. It was the draft in Arlington, 2018? I wasn't a big fan of that move. He's still there. Right? He's still there. He's been a solid contributor there at the left side for a long time now. So ended up being the right call when, I was hoping they were going to get Derwin James or someone else, a guy at a skill position. Well, sometimes the best skill position is the offensive line. So there's that to think about. But yeah, man, I'm back and forth on it. Trust and believe, man. And that's why I'm glad that we're getting so much great contribution and so many great thoughts from Raider Nation. Eddie S., thanks so much for the call. Appreciate you. Got a text from Raider Jason at the 304. Hey, Q, here's my order for picks for the mock draft. 1, Membu, the offensive tackle. 2, T-Mac, that's the wide receiver. And 3, Genty. I'd be happy if the silver and black drafted any of those dudes. That'd be a serious move. As always, love the show. Just win, baby. Go Raiders. That's Raider Jason in 304 talking about the Raiders being a serious team, right? Not being unserious, not for entertainment purposes only, but acting as a serious team, which is something that has been kind of a theme all year long since my guy Joe Fortenbaugh from ESPN actually mentioned that to me, and it made a lot of sense. So I've been trying to categorize this Raiders team and the decisions, the moves they've made so far in the offseason, obviously the new league year. So there you go. He's good with Membu, T-Mac, Genty. Any of those three, he'll walk away feeling happy on day one of the NFL draft. Raider Jason, thanks so much for the text. Definitely appreciate you. And I think all those definitely make sense. The question is, which one do I want to go with the most? And the first overall pick, like who am I going to make the decision on, right? And you can even throw Mason Graham in there if he's available at number 6. Oh, boy, then you really got a problem. But thank you for the text. I appreciate you. Up next, got a call from No Hating Raider. He's calling to talk about the draft scenario with the 3 realistic options at 6, Genty, Membu, or T-Mac, and also shares his thoughts on the Geno Smith extension. Here's No Hating Raider.
Q, what's up? No Hating Raider here. I want to chime in on the pick that you guys have going up. So, first, I think at pick 6, I'm thinking we trade back because the 3 people that you mentioned, we trade back at 9, one of those 3 will be there, guaranteed. So I'm good with taking one of those 3 with that 6th pick, trading back to 9. But looking at the Geno Smith situation, there's no reason for us to announce an extension because if we do that, all we're doing is showing our cards of where we're going to go in the draft. So we might as well wait until the draft is over, and then if we don't pick up a quarterback, we can then announce that we signed Geno to an extension. But if somebody like Shador falls to us at 6, then we just sign Shador, and we pick up Shador, and then next thing you know, we just let Geno Smith's contract expire because he already had that $16 million from the roster bonus. So that's the way I'm thinking about it. Hopefully, in the draft, I would love to take Genty. I would love to see a prime-time running back like we used to have with Bo Jackson, but something, that's what got me into Raider football. But, Amari Hampton, I'd like him in a second. Let me know what you guys think. No hate, Raider out, Las Vegas. See ya.
Thank you so much for the call, my man. It's always great to hear from you. Trading back, and you feel like one of those guys will be there. Well, you heard what Mike T had to say in segment number 2. You better be sure, right? And you better have multiple options, right? Don't just have one guy you're targeting if you're going to trade back and know how far you're going to go. As far as Geno goes, I couldn't imagine them waiting till after the draft to see what they do before they give him an extension. Like, I couldn't see that. I could imagine, especially with Pete Carroll having that relationship, they already have a good idea of what they're going to do. They might already have the extension done for all we know. Like, that's something I want to be very clear about. They don't have to announce it just because they've gotten it done. They have to announce it at some point, right? But so I just couldn't imagine that they'd wait to see what happens in the draft. Now, I could see them structuring it so they can move on from Geno quickly if they do get a guy at 6, say a quarterback is there and they're a guy they feel comfortable with, or even maybe they get a guy in the round 2 and then, they feel like he could possibly be the guy. Like, say they get Jackson Dart and they're like, yeah, we only need Geno for a year or maybe 2. Structure the contract so they can get out of it. I can see that happening. I just can't see them saying, we're not going to give you an extension until after we find out what happens in the draft. Now, they could end up being like the Houston Texans. Remember a few years ago, they traded for Laramie Tunsil from the Miami Dolphins, the offensive tackle, and they didn't give him an extension until after the year, right? And I thought that was a mistake because you end up paying more because guys normally have career years. Like, if they don't give Geno an extension, he'll probably ball out and have a huge season, and maybe that's what they're banking on, right? And then all of a sudden it's going to cost you even more money. So it's a fine line. I always like when teams just, if you're going to trade for a guy, he needs an extension, just give it to him. It's kind of, I don't want to say bizarre. It's just a little different the way they're approaching it. But it's a new staff, and we're learning their tendencies. So maybe this is something that's par for the course for what John Spytek and Pete Carroll plan on doing moving forward. But thanks so much for that call. Definitely appreciate you. Really good stuff. Just got time for a couple more. This text is from Raider Nation Mason. What's up, Q? It's Raider Nation Mason. First and foremost, prayers to Raven and his family. Can't imagine how that feels going into the Locked On Mock. If it goes the way you've predicted, Ward, which would already be picked, Shador, Travis, Abdul, then Mason. It's between McMillan and Will Johnson to me. I wouldn't be mad at Genty because he's a great running back, but in such a deep class when we have so many needs, we can get first-round talent in the second, even third round at the running back position. This isn't a very deep wide receiver or cornerback draft. Both T-Mac and Will are immediate upgrades. I honestly hope that the Jags take Will or Warren because I want Graham the most. I think he's propels our defensive line to incredible new heights, and it's cool we have the same first name. Have a good day. Go Q. That's Raider Nation Mason. Definitely appreciate you, my man. That is kind of cool, right? You would have to figure out a way to make that into a jersey, right? You just put Raider Nation Mason and then whatever his number would be. That would be cool. I like that. And yeah, Mason Graham would be a fantastic player. Will Johnson. We know that Pete Carroll loves his DBs, right? And Will Johnson is a guy. He's a Michigan man. He's a guy that is a heck of a player, right? And I think that the Raiders definitely need to address the cornerback position. I think they're going to have a lot of competition at that position. He very well could be in play, and we're not really even talking about him too much. So that could be a guy that could be in play. T-Mac might not be the only wide receiver that is a top 10 guy. It could end up being Matthew Golden, the wide receiver from Texas as well. They both hit the 50-50 ball really well. The one thing I do know is that the Raiders have to get a wide receiver at some point. I don't know what they're going to do. I know they have a meeting, a top 30 visit lined up with Luther Burden, who's a really good wide receiver. He's out of Missouri, which happens to be the same school that Armand Menbu is from. So there you go. Maybe it's a 2-for-1 fact-finding mission, but Luther Burden's going to be coming in for a visit with the Raiders. So, there's a few different options that they have, but they definitely need to address the wide receiver position across from Jacoby Myers. And obviously Brock Bowers is there as a weapon, but he is a tight end and not a wide receiver. So there's that. So, yeah, there's a few different options, my man. Definitely a few options. Appreciate the text. That is for sure. We'll close things out with a call from Ronald Raider from Mexico. He's calling to talk about what he feels like the Raiders need to do in the draft. Here he is, Ronald Raider out of Mexico.
Hey, Q. This is Raider calling from Mexico. First-time caller. Wanted to call in, just give my 2 cents on what I think should happen in the draft. I remember this guy that was on your podcast that you mentioned that Al Davis would go for Genty, a guy who could put the ball in the end zone, which I could agree, but I also think that Raiders are long gone from the Al Davis days. I think his influence isn't there. And I think it's a good thing because, as we know, as time passed, it wasn't the best. His last days weren't the best. So after listening and seeing the prospects, and if Membo is at the number 6 position as well as Genty, I hope they take Membo. I hope they build the trenches. I mean, sure, it's awesome to have a good running back, but the trenches, man. And if whatever Spike Pick has been saying that he's going to build through the trenches, start there, I think he will, and we should go for Membo, the right tackle. We could get a running back maybe in the 3rd round. So running back, a good offensive line gives you a good running game, gives you a good passing game, really helps out, right? So that's where I'm hoping they'll go. Let's hope that this new era, this new Spike Tech Tom Brady era, is what we really need. It hasn't been easy. I've been a fan since I was born, 1983, and loved the game of football since I was 6 years old, and I've been a Raider since day one. So let's hope these guys get back on track and for it to be a good season. Go Raiders. Oh, and if Shedeur Sanders is there, I'm sorry, can't curse. Let's take Sanders then. All right. Much love, Q. Appreciate what you do every day. We'll be talking, man. Have a good day.
Double R, thanks so much for the call. Appreciate you. And yeah, that was John McClain that said Al would get the guy that could put the ball in the end zone, right? And again, it made sense when he said it, and it still makes sense. Like it definitely means sense to go and get Genty because of the playmaking ability. And look, the Raiders have struggled in the red zone, right? They've struggled to get the ball in the end zone as of years. So, having a guy that has the ability to get it in the end zone from anywhere on the field, it makes sense. As far as the trenches go, also makes a lot of sense, right? That's why I threw it out there. It's hard to make the right call, right? I mean, again, Genty feels like the splashy pick, the one that'll get the fans fired up, but the offensive tackle will be the guy that can hold it down for 10-plus years. The value could be there for sure. We go back to value, back to what Raider Rickey from Virginia said. So, again, what do you prefer? What is it that makes you better immediately, but also is going to make you better for the long run? That's the call. Right. And so if you feel like that there's a guy that's comparable at the running back position later on, then maybe you get him later. If you feel like Ashton Genty is heads and tails way better than anybody else, then maybe you have no option but to go Genty at number 6. So that's all we got time for. It's a really good dilemma. Again, as I mentioned, many moons ago when we found out the Raiders were picking number 6 overall, they're in line to get a really good player, whether that's a offensive lineman, whether that's a cornerback, whether that's a running back, whether that's a defensive tackle, whether that's, whatever the case may be, they're in line to get a really good player, wide receiver, whatever, right? And, of course, if quarterback's there, that's an option as well. But they don't have to feel desperate because they do have Geno Smith already in the mix. So thanks so much for the calls. Definitely appreciate that. Coming up tomorrow, we'll deep dive into a little, well, not deep dive, but we'll hear a little bit about Texas's road, their pro day when it comes to Quinn Ewers, the quarterback, Matthew Golden, the wide receiver. My guy, Mike Hardball Harge, was a guest on my show, so we'll get a couple minutes from him on that. Mike T talked about some players during his conference call, so we'll talk about some of the players that he's looking at and what he feels about those guys. We'll have more calls and texts. We'll have more news and notes, and we'll see what direction we go as we close out the week. But definitely appreciate it. It's been a fun week so far, Raider Nation, and look forward to closing things out really strong. So until tomorrow, Raider Nation, take care of yourself, take care of your family, love on your family. Most importantly, as always, just win, baby.